get us started with our next panel. Not that I don't love hearing you all talk, but I'm sure you might be more interested in the group that we have coming here in a short bit. So let me again give you just a brief snapshot on what we wanted to do with this event. This is about this launch of the Business of the Arts minor, and we really do believe that these two different impulses are too often not in conversation with one another. The artistic and the business side, to some degree, when they're pulled together, end up creating really interesting and impactful experiences, both in the culinary world and beyond. And so we're really excited at WashU to be able to bring this to our student population, and obviously excited to raise the level of conversation around these same issues here at Olin. So I am going to introduce our four panelists. Danny is the first one, and you've already heard his bio, so he said no more of my bio. So Danny Meyer, there you go, that's all you have. And we can re-thank him for coming on. And then what we have here are three people that have been living in the local as well as the national food scene as well. Sure, that's great. The first one is Zoe Robinson. So Zoe opened her first restaurant in 1983 and has been in St. Louis alongside this transformation of the culinary world around here. She's best known most recently for creating what might be known as Restaurant Row in Clayton, with her beloved establishments E. Fratellini, which I was practicing pronouncing beforehand, Bar La Frere, and Billie Jean. And she was, in 2019, Billie Jean was given a James Beard Foundation Best Chef in the Midwest semifinalist nod. So, Zoe. Next, we will bring out Kevin Nashan. Kevin Nashan I know because we used to exchange triathlon training tips. I gave him swim lessons in exchange for food at Sydney Street, which to this day is still the best deal I have ever had along the way. Kevin has worked at restaurants around the globe, from San Sebastian, Spain, which on his recommendation I recently visited. It was fantastic. To Danielle, which we talked about just a bit ago in New York, and he took over Sydney Street Cafe in 2003. Kevin won the James Beard Award for the Best Chef in Midwest in 2017, after being a finalist in 14 and 16 and a 5-time semifinalist. Kevin has now 3 restaurants, one in St. Louis of Sydney Street, another in St. Louis up the street, Peacemaker, and then another Peacemaker that is also out of town. So wonderful to have you here, not in Tulsa, but back in St. Louis. So. And then finally, Gerard Craft. Gerard Craft is the Food and Wine Best New Chef, Food and Wine, can I just keep going on the list here, Gerard? Food and Wine Innovator of the Year, 2015 James Beard Foundation Award-winning Best Chef in the Midwest, Inc. Magazine Star Entrepreneur, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So Gerard has been playing in this space in St. Louis, also has trained in a number of different places around the country and around the world. Niche Food Group now includes 6 restaurants in St. Louis and 1 in Nashville. And those 6 restaurants include Creative Cocktails at Taste by Niche, French Bistro Fair at Brasserie, Pastaria, Sardella, Brasswell, so on and so forth. And then most recently, Cinder House, that is inspired to some degree by an idea that perhaps we'll talk about in a short bit. So welcome to our 4 panelists. So I want to start by building on something Danny talked about just a bit ago. And it's this idea that a restaurant and a restaurant concept might emerge out of some combination or iteration or ordering of idea, chef, and place. And what I'd love to hear, just to get us started to hear a bit more about your story, is what that combination looked like, with maybe one restaurant that comes top of mind, maybe your baby right now, or your first, or the one you're most excited about, whatever it might be. So Gerard, why don't you kick us off?
All right. So I think a perfect example of what you're talking about is we were actually out looking to open an Italian restaurant, and somebody told me that the Chez Leon space was going to be coming up, and that Leon wanted to get out of the business and was going to sell us the restaurant. And so we were looking at that space just to put maybe an Italian restaurant in there. And then when we got in there, we started to realize kind of what an important space it was, not only to St. Louis, but also to ourselves personally. I think, we had our rehearsal dinner at Chez Leon. The night we found out we were having a baby, we went to Chez Leon. So Chez Leon was really important to us. And I think even though we had no intention of opening a French restaurant, when we got in there, we said, this has to be a French restaurant. I mean, we have to kind of keep up with this. And it's something
what
that I
about that
love.
point? When you got to that moment, when you said this has to be French, how did you have that sort of inspiration?
I think the space, and I mean, if you go into the space, even though it's changed quite a bit since then, but I mean, it just feels like an old French bistro that you would stumble into in Paris. And all of my favorite restaurants in Paris are all bistros. None of them really are the Michelin-starred restaurants. It's these little tucked away, hole in the walls like Chez Denis that just like Danny talks about, is they feel like a warm hug when you go into them. And it really, the whole thing, from the doors in the front, everything about it just felt French. So
fantastic. Kevin, what about for you? When you were thinking about launching a particular restaurant, did it start with place or chef or menu or idea? Take us through a particular choice for you.
Well, I blame this guy for Peacemaker because
that was a lot of whiskey, by the way.
It was a long night, and Peacemaker, really short on that. It was the old niche space, and Gerard definitely was like, I want get out of this, and so I kind of like, well, you get selfish as you get older. So like, what do I want to eat after working at Sydney and that kind of thing? And so I loved East Coast fare, and I loved eating po' boys because I lived in New Orleans for 4 years, and it was just that was kind of like the inspiration. But like most recently in Tulsa, I have a space right next to the Peacemaker there, and I've been like, I have to do something. And my wife was like, you should do something that you really love and really care about. And so I grew up in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and my family had this restaurant for 27 years called La Tertulia. It meant the gathering place, and it's native to Mexican food. So that space was dictated more of like, and that's why I'm going to open in March, of something that I want to honor my family and cherish. And I don't think that there's one set rules for any of it. There's different circumstances, and I think that it just kind of plays for me. That's how it works. And now obviously the food and that kind of thing.
So before we get to Zoe on this, this idea of honoring your family, how does that play itself out into menu choices, into design choices, in the aesthetic? What is the honoring piece? How could I see that if I were to go there in March?
Well, I think...
Is that yours?
Whoa!
And I don't think coffee's allowed in here, if I remember right. So I followed the rules.
Yeah. I think, really keeping it simple and really honing. I'm not going to have some brand new updated menu. I'm going to have dishes like carne adobada and pozole and house-made corn tortillas and that kind of thing. But I'm really going to pay homage back to my family and the stuff I grew up on. And I remember all those bites and and just the wonderful times. And I think that that's going to come and kind of show forth. Like just being natural, be you. Like Danny said, just. You don't have to be anybody else. Just be you, and that's what I want La Tertulia to be. I want it to be a warm hug when you walk in, and if like you ate it in Santa Fe at La Tertulia, I want you to walk in and be like, "Wow, this is so La Tertulia."
Fantastic. Zoe, what about for you?
I generally covet real estate. I find a space that I want, and I work and work and work and wear the people down until they lease it to me. So it generally takes years for my restaurants to come to fruition, but all three that I have right now were exactly that, me wearing 3 landlords down. So the spaces themselves inspired me, especially Billie Jean, which is my baby right now. It was a decrepit building, but it had this fantastic window in the back of it, and it used to be a hair salon, and then it was a yogurt shop. And finally, when I got my hands on it, I thought, I built that space really around the window, and it's not a great window. It's decrepit and nothing good about it. My contractor wanted to cover it up immediately. But I just knew that was going to help me create the atmosphere that I wanted.
So it's both, if I'm hearing you right, both the particulars of a space itself, a window, as well as a neighborhood and a feel of that area.
And well, my 3 restaurants are all within 1 block of each other. So, you know, having all of these play together and trying to do different concepts, but still, I think that they say Zoe. But these guys, they're chefs, and I'm sure that food is probably at the forefront of their minds when they start. And for me, it's more the feeling, the aesthetic, the space, what I want to build. And it's not that the food isn't important, it's huge. But generally, I do my menu last. And I have a general idea of what I'm going to do, but for me, it's that aesthetic and the feeling and the experience that I want to create. And that's selfish, it's me wanting to design something. So that's my art, I hope. But bringing it all together, you know, is huge. And making all of that work together, the hospitality, the space, the environment, and the food.
Great. So we're going to come back to Danny in a bit, but we've heard a bit from Danny, and so we wanted to focus a bit on the 3 of you. We've been talking about this idea of chef as, again, artist and as executive, and to some degree, over the course of your career, that blend evolves, right? When you first started in a restaurant, you might be behind the stove, thinking of the menu, coming up with the food itself, and then it has to evolve perhaps more to some of the executive things, whether it's social media, whether it's managing staff. When you think about the blend of your life right now, what is it? Is it a 50-50? Is it 75-25? And what are the activities that fit into both of those camps? Gerard, we'll start with you again.
All right. I think this is one of my biggest challenges, and has been from the beginning. I'm actually a college dropout, so you know, and while I was studying business, you know, I was not great at it, you know, and probably had no business, you know, quite frankly, opening a business, you know. And I think when you're a chef, you kind of get this notion of I'm opening a restaurant. It's this very romantic idea, and you know, this is the kind of creative side, and I think probably plagues a lot of chef restaurateurs out there, in that you know how to cook, really good cook. You know, you go in, I'm going to open this. I know all the pieces, I guess, that need to be there, you know, but you have no clue how to read a P&L. And I think that's put me in a lot of tough spots over the time. So I really have had to learn how to be an executive second. And it took me years to, you know, and God, I'm still learning. But it took me years even to get to the point where I really understood every aspect of just the financial statements. And so I think, you know, you were talking the other day about what is it, you know, does it drive you more the art side or the business side, and how do you balance those two things? And I think that's a really big struggle in the food world, when, you know, what critics want and what your artistic side wants don't necessarily meet up with what, you know, the P&L wants. And I think there does need to be a lot of thought, and Kevin and I talk about it a lot. There needs to be so much thought into, you know, does it make money? And, you know, how is it funded? Maybe if it's even publicly funded, but it needs to make money because that's oxygen. And, you know, I think, you know, artists don't want to talk about money. They don't want to think about money. And but at the end of the day, if you want to keep doing what you love to do, at the end of the day, you have to make money, or it's gone. So.
So it sounds like there's both this mix of this cultural barrier you're getting over, which is saying I need to think about the business side of it, and then there's also the self-learn piece of how do I figure this out, and the tactics and the tools and the P&L that is a part of that story for you. Yeah. Great. Kevin, what about for you?
I think it's, you know, spot on with that. I think that I wish early in my career, you know, one of my role models, and he doesn't know it, but my father-in-law is out here, and he's always been like, always sitting in the back and just kind of chipping away and just kind of making sure that we're going the right course. But, I wish early on, I would have gotten a lot more direction in terms of like, okay, if you're going to do a build out, you want to do it as have it beautiful, but like really inexpensive. And then like, like this is how to read a P&L. This is like, hey, listen, this is what you have to spend, after a couple of years of doing this and knowing your trends, this is what you have this week to spend. And, just historically it's slow, it's Halloween, but you don't know this. And then you think like, oh, you get to work in all these incredible restaurants. I worked at Danielle and all these restaurants, and it's not about a refrigerator full of foie gras and mushrooms and truffles. It's like, wow, who's going to buy these? And am I going to make money on this? And why can't I just have a real simple chicken dish that's delicious that everybody wants? And that's kind of what we toy. But you want to be creative too, and that's the art form of it. And you don't want to lose that because that's your character. But it's like, well, how do you stay in business? And you look at the fatality rate of any business. I mean, restaurants are high, but that's what happens. They don't have that mentorship. They don't have people saying, hey, listen, you have to pay, salaries. You have to pay, a bunch of different stuff. So that's it's always going to be forever something that you have to balance.
Great. So we're going to come back to that in a short bit, because I love this idea of creativity within constraints, right? If you say, I've got a certain margin that I've got to make, I've got certain ingredients. Sometimes we think of that as constraining creativity, but in other ways, think jazz, right? When you limit the keys, as Danny mentioned earlier, to some degree, there's a good bit of flexibility that you might have within that. So we're going to come back to that a bit and maybe hear your take on that as well. But Zoe, what about for you? Artist, executive?
Fortunately, I get to exercise both of those things every day, and I enjoy both aspects. I have really good people who work for me and people who have taught me. Early in my career, and I come from the front of the house, so I was able to learn more about the financial side. And I worked for enough people that went under that I was able to see where they made their mistakes. And I learned from that. But I do think for me it is really fun looking at the numbers and knowing that we're going to be able to make payroll and pay our rent and, take care of things that we need to, but then be able to help create a menu at the end of the day and be able to work on my space and, come up with new ideas of how we can do things better on a day-to-day basis.
So Danny, I want to pull you into this right here. One of the things that what has been a recurring theme in conversations with Kevin and Gerard, most in particular, over the last little bit, has been the energy that they get when they see their own chefs transition out to create new restaurants and to essentially develop as executives and as chefs over time. When you think about doing that piece well inside your own business, how do you take people that may come more from this artistic bent side, may have perhaps an aversion towards thinking about the business side at the very front end, and cultivate both this creativity in them as well as this business acumen?
I think that one of the challenging parts about this conversation is that there's an implied conflict between the two. And I think that they, as Gerard just said, they need to go together. And I think that in my career, because we've placed so much of an emphasis on how our team takes care of each other, and then how they take care of our guests, and then how they take care of our community and our suppliers, and we always put our investors fifth in that, that there were some people who believed that what we meant was this was a totem pole where the investor was at the bottom and we didn't care, and that making money is antithetical to expressing some artistic part of the business. And it's taken me a lot of years to finally learn how to teach people that it's not a totem pole, but it's a virtuous cycle. And if you break the virtuous cycle anywhere, you've broken the whole thing. And with a virtuous cycle, because we put our team first, doesn't mean that making money, the investor is last. It means that it actually means it's maybe the most important. The input is where we start. In a virtuous cycle, one good thing keeps getting even better. So the input is how it feels to come to work. And if that feels great, we think we stand a much better chance of delighting our guests.
That's true.
And if we delight our guests, we stand a better chance of having more revenue with which we can do better things for our community, which will then root for our success. We can get better ingredients. And we should have more money left over for our investors. And by the way, the only way to ultimately take care of each other is to have really happy investors, because otherwise we don't get raises, we don't get promotions. And so, as Gerard was just saying, he used the word oxygen. I use the word fuel. And I think that if you think about when you plan a driving trip, you don't plan the driving trip for the purpose of having a full tank of gas. But you do need a full tank of gas to get where you're trying to go. And so that's been really helpful to try to have people understand that you have to do both, or you don't get to do the other. And I think about music a lot with this. So maybe there is an artistic connection, but when I was growing up, I always looked forward to the next release of an album of a favorite group, because I was always interested to see where are they going to go next. And if you think about the Beatles, every single album they put out took them and took us in a whole new direction. And some of the stuff they did was highly experimental, highly artistic, using tabla drums and sitars and some weird stuff. But even every one of those albums had a piece of bubble gum in it. And I say that in a great way, but the White Album had Obla Di Obla Da, right? There was going to be something that was going to sell a ton so that they could do that other stuff. And I feel like restaurants often have to kind of balance. You better ultimately have salmon on the menu, whether you like it or not.
Right. It's true.
So to build on that, this idea of a bit of a red thread that combines particular restaurant choices over time, I'm curious for each of you, how you would think of what unites your restaurants. What is that red thread that holds it all together, whether it's in Restaurant Row or across cities or across fast casual to fine dining? And we'll go in any sort of order. We don't have to stay in the same flow. What do you think?
Oh, that's a tough one.
I'm throwing Zoe new questions all the time.
I know, I hate that. For me, I think because I do have such small restaurants and we are a team, I would only, aspire to be as good as your team. But no, but we really do.
I come to St. Louis to eat with you.
but we do try to create a culture, and I think that is the thread, I hope, that ties my restaurants together, and that is kind of my brand in St. Louis. We really do try to make our employees as happy as they can be, and we try to make them be as kind to each other as they can be, which is a struggle. Front of the house and back of the house, that's a constant war. So, but hopefully it's how we treat our guests, and how we treat our guests comes from how we treat our employees. So I hope that's the thread that ties us together.
So let me give you a brief anecdote about that. I was at one of Zoe's restaurants 2 nights ago, and we were talking through some questions and just having a wonderful meal. And when she walked away, I grabbed one of her servers, and I said, "Why do you stay here?" And they said, "I'm leaving tomorrow." They said one of the things that made them stay there was your attention to detail and your care for them as employees. They told the story about you at some point cleaning the ceiling and having to reset all the tables afterwards. And that server said, "This is the kind of place I want to work." So I think in a lot of ways it has threaded through your various different restaurants. Kevin, what about for you?
Well, I mean, without saying, culture is the key. And I think that saying that, I think a lot of things develop culture. I think that, yes, you want to have a really fun, happy environment, but you also have to have an environment that holds each other accountable. And you have to have guidelines and strict guidelines. And knowing that if you follow these guidelines, it's all going to be great. But I feel like over the years, the restaurants kind of police themselves. At Sydney Street, we've had, employees been there, at least 5 out of the 40 been there for 17 years. And then, the others have 12 to 13 years. And it's not because they're there for me. They're there because they love coming to work every day, and they self-police themselves so that if a new person comes in and they're not willing to do that symbiotic kind of circle of trust and stuff that they leave, and it's not an angry thing or anything like that. It's just more of like how they know that these are what variables they have to make their guests happy, and in doing so, that's how they kind of like create that culture. And the culture is almost natural, but it almost self-police itself.
Fantastic. Gerard, what about for you?
If we're talking about culture, and I think even though I read Setting the Table when it came out, I don't think I truly understood everything about Setting the Table when it came out. And I was a young chef. I was 25 years old when we opened Niche, and I worked for a lot of crazy people over the years. I think the kitchen, I think I've described it before as growing up on a pirate ship to some degrees.
It's so scary.
And so it took us a while to really understand what drove us and understood how to codify our values. And what Danny's talking about, there were 4 that we already had inherently that we just didn't know how to express, and those were honesty. And by honesty, it was more like being able to have those hard conversations, because I think that's one of the hardest things that all organizations deal with is, hey, that doesn't work, or this food doesn't necessarily taste good. And we laugh, but it really is amazing how hard it is for people when they're in that situation to really have those conversations. Innovation and creating legacy. These are all things that we really always drove for, but the number one was hospitality, and we always talked about it. I mean, it came out of our mouth. It was more than all the rest of them, but we had never really flipped that on its head. And talking about hospitality, towards our employees and towards our vendors, even if that was the U.S. Foods driver that was 5 hours late. So talking about more empathy in the way that we do everything, I think really changed our business. Even though it was going in the right direction, it really slowed us down and made us really look at what the most important pieces of our business were. And the employees, as you can hear from everybody up here, are the most important. So starting there, and then going along, I think has been what's driven us into the future.
So Danny, to build on that, there's this idea of a uniting red thread that's the Danny Meyer ethos that comes through your restaurants. But how do you think about the innovation, the different concepts, right? So the Beatles didn't do the exact same album every time. There's a red thread there, but there's some innovation and distinctiveness. How do you go about defining that or coming up with the vision for what the next concept would be, whether it's you or your team?
Well, before I answer that,
Good.
for me, the red thread, I can be really brief, is the word belonging. Because I think that is the prime motivator for people who want to work in a restaurant. You belong to, Zoe used the word family. Restaurants feel like a family unit, except that they go away. Your family doesn't ever, you wouldn't ever fire your family, but it is a family unit. And people want to belong. And I think restaurant guests want to belong to a restaurant. What we all want regulars at our restaurants. And a restaurant regular is someone who somehow established that they belong there and the restaurant wanted them to belong. And I think that understanding that human motivator and then using every opportunity, starting with your 2 ears and your heart, to deliver that is a good thing. So in terms of, I feel like whenever we open a new restaurant, one of the early, regardless of whether it started with chef, place, or idea, it has to successfully answer a question, which is, why does the world need this? What problem is this solving that doesn't already exist? I have zero interest in opening a place that doesn't answer a question, what do we have to add to the dialogue on this topic? So that doesn't mean that we're inventing something new. I could make a great case that growing up here was absolutely foundational to why Shake Shack happened. I had smashed burgers, I had frozen custard, I had crinkle cut fries, and milkshakes. We didn't invent any of that stuff whatsoever. So then you ask, well, why does the world need it? You know, what do we have to add to the dialogue? And I think increasingly what we're starting to do and feel and see, and I think Daily Provisions is a good example. We have one kind of donut called a cruller. We have one kind of soup. We have one kind of, you know, we have handful of breads, but we try to answer this question, which is, rather than inventing something new, can we take an approach of serving food you know, but maybe better than you knew it could be? And, or at least better than you knew it could be for that price. And I think that we're also constantly aware of another factor that we haven't, I haven't certainly talked about today, which is time. And I think that time has always been fleeting. And obviously with every minute we each get older, we have 1 minute less thereafter. And I think understanding that the way we use people's time, especially in a time when people have so much more to do with their time than they've ever had. You know, we were talking earlier, when I grew up here, we had 4 TV stations. And chances are really good if you mentioned something on one of those stations, 85% of the people you're talking to had seen that same show or heard about that same show. And we certainly didn't have the internet and apps and, you know, people, there's so many time sucks right now that it's amazing. And so how we use people's time with our product is crucial. Why am I bringing this into this? Probably the greatest restaurant export of all time from this country has been fast food. You may or may not like it, but you can't argue that it has taken over the world. And what that did was to basically tell people, just like an architect tells you, when you design something and then they tell you how much it's going to cost and how long it's going to take, and they go, well, that's the rule of 2. Quality, time, and cost. You can have any 2. Which do you want? And I always hated that. But fast food did it better than anybody. They said, you want it fast? You want it cheap? Obviously, you're not going to have naturally raised beef. And obviously, we're not going to use Valrhona chocolate in our milkshake and all that kind of stuff. And I think what you're starting to see right now from really successful restaurants is they understand the power of time and quality. People are not any longer willing to park quality or taste in the back lot. They want that, but it still has to take less time, and it still has to cost less money. And I think more and more you're starting to see, and I'd love to go to Peacemaker because I guarantee you you're doing it there.
It's delicious.
But you're probably finding a way to give me more quality per dollar and per minute than I used to have. And so what we have found, and I'll just finish with this, is that it's still the rule of 2. But whoever wrote the rule that the only way to get to 2 is 1 + 1 + 0. And so what you're starting to see with more and more restaurants is they're going 0.65 plus 0.65. Help me with the math, somebody.
0.7.
Thank you, plus 0.7. So I'll give you 0.65% of the price savings and 0.65% of the cost savings and 0.7% of the quality. You may or may not get a waiter, waitress, reservation, table, linen, flowers, you know, pastry chef, sommelier. Restaurants are finding ways to cut out some of the things you say you don't need, but they're giving you more of the quality and more of your time back as a result.
Good, and I think to some degree that does get at this idea of the constraints, right? The constraints are still there. It can be a low-margin business in a lot of ways, especially in fine dining. But do you find ways to move things around in ways that allow you to be creative within those constraints? So I'm curious for you all, what are the constraints most top of mind for you? Is it staffing? Is it time? And how do you try to be creative within those? What is, again, Kevin, you mentioned this idea of the chicken sandwich, especially well done. That's an idea of constraints around ingredients, constraints around time, and still having to have quality. What does that jazz of creativity within constraints look like for you all?
Kevin's got a chicken sandwich, come on.
Well, I don't personally serve a chicken sandwich, but I think constraints.
Kevin, it's a
I think
metaphor.
constraints. The thing with restaurants and with any business is they are breathing, right? So what happened yesterday with all the problems could be completely different today, and it'll be completely different tomorrow. So I think that more importantly is that with any of this is that you have to always just kind of balance everything. So in knowing with a chicken sandwich, knowing when, why are you putting something on your menu? Why are you, what is the purpose of doing this right now? And if you're dealing with issues with employees and that kind of thing today, obviously it kind of affects everything. So
That's great.
yep.
So Gerard, to build on this a bit, I remember having a conversation with the three of us, you, me, and Kevin, talking about cost of chicken. And the idea that you have a certain desire to have a high quality ingredients, and sometimes you have competitors or other places that might not have that same sort of constraint. They might cut their costs. Why is it that you would constrain yourself there, principally, to say that this is something that I want to hold to, and then how do you creatively work around it? Convincing your customers maybe of the value of that, or cutting costs in other ways? What does that look like for you?
Yeah, so the chicken one always comes up, and I think we talk about it in the restaurants a lot. Is that we want to use really good chicken, and not just really good chicken, because I think, I think there's plenty of places that have made commodity chicken taste good, but kind of really honest chicken, and that kind of serves as this barometer when we're talking about fast food or anything. And partially, I think the conversation was why so many chef-driven fast food places fail, is because I think inherently we have this desire to support farmers and also to be honest with the food that we're serving. And I always say that I think that if I had to switch to commodity chicken, I would have a lot of trouble actually sleeping at night. I mean, I already have a lot of trouble sleeping at night, but even more trouble. So, I do think that the notion of cost, I think, really is one of the ones that weighs heavily on me, and it's not just for chicken. So chicken is almost a metaphor for everything. I mean, it's employee benefits. How many employee benefits can we give? How many, what level of chicken can we serve? What quality of vegetables can we serve? All these things. Can we get the table made by our friend versus, a commodity table off Amazon, whatever it is. There's all these pieces that all end up in what that price tag is on the menu and what that number is on the bottom line, the investor line. And, so trying to really balance where you're putting each of those dollars, I think probably takes up, the majority of our conversations within our company, because they're all, none is more really important than the other to us. We have deep feelings about every single one of those things. So I think that's always the challenge of how much can you charge where there's still value. I mean, we want people to feel value when they eat in our restaurant. So how much can you charge versus what do you, the 0.65, the 0.65 and the 0.7, there's, these sacrifices, obviously we want the best of everything, want to pay all of our employees $1 million a year, and I truly mean that. But, obviously they're businesses and they need to operate. So these are all really, really tough conversations.
So what about for you?
It's exactly that. Those are the tough conversations, and it's huge. If I could buy every one of my employees' health insurance, and how much can I actually charge for that plate of chicken in order to make that happen. It's those trade-offs.
So Danny, we didn't get to hop into this in our first conversation, but you ended by saying we need to think about the people side in a bit more of a sophisticated fashion, both around wages and benefits and the like. How have you factored that piece into your equation as you've tried to balance these pieces?
Well, it's primary, and I didn't know if you were going to ask me that last question, but the things that we're always trying to balance are people, profits, and purpose. And almost every time you pull the lever on one, you're making it a little tougher on the other. And, you know, if Gerard wants honest chickens, by the way, what is a dishonest?
But dishonest chicken?
It clucks a lie.
If you Google it, it's terrifying.
It's actually pink slime.
So yeah, and I think that one of our purposes is actually people. So in that respect, it's the hardest thing going today. One of the good things about an economy with low unemployment is there's a whole lot of people who are doing something, but a lot of the people who came to our industry in the first place were people who were on their way towards doing something else.
Right.
They now already have that something else, so they don't use us as a stopping point. In my case, so many people came to New York first. Kevin did, I know that, for your career, because you wanted that on your You don't have to do that anymore because every city in the country has great restaurants. And it costs too damn much money to live in New York, so why should I live with 5 roommates in New York in order to work in a restaurant when there's a restaurant maybe even better in my hometown at this point? So getting high quality people, paying them in a town that costs a lot of money, way more than a living wage, caused us to actually break the tipping system. And that has been and that's kind of connected to purpose, because one of our purposes has been I got really tired, starting with myself, of having people apologizing for being in the hospitality business as if they had let their parents down and done something that their parents didn't really want them to do. And I'm working in a restaurant, but I'm really going to be a fill in the blank. And I got really tired of that. And I felt personally like the tipping system, especially for front of the house, because that's who qualifies for tips, was actually creating a dead end where a lot of people were making enough money to never have to get another job. And they were actually making more money than the next rung on the ladder, which is being a manager. So there was a dead end. They couldn't be a manager without taking a 25% pay cut. And they weren't really advancing their professional opportunities to grow and do even more. And I also found the tipping system was keeping our cooks from earning more money, because every time the restaurant would raise their menu prices to keep up with anything, health insurance, the menu price goes up, the tipped employees were making a multiplier, more money. The cooks never got a raise out of that. And so our purpose and our people went like this, and then the profits actually tried to speak up at the same time, because now you've got a 3-legged stool, which is can you make it better for your people? Can you charge prices that people are willing to pay? There's 26,000 restaurants in New York. All you have to do is Google any of them and you can see what the menu prices are. It's really hard for people to do reverse math, because now our menu prices, they include everything. So there's no opportunity to tip afterwards. And so how do we balance all this and then have profits left over at the end after we've done all the things we want to try to do for our people, because that's our purpose. And it's a really, really hard equation to get right. And I don't think I wouldn't go back ever, because I think it's been great. We've been doing this since 2015 and rolling out a new restaurant about every 6 months. That's how long it takes to get the math right. But I'll tell you, it's a hard thing to do that.
That would be wonderful.
So I want to end with one final question. because I know there's fantastic food out there, and I never like to stand in front of fantastic food. And I'll do it somewhat rapid fire before allowing the chefs to mingle with you all, right? So they're going to be out there talking and eating as well and being able to answer some of the questions you might have. Danny, when we were chatting about a week ago, you highlighted a tweet from the food critic at the Washington Post. And he said something to the order of some of the best restaurants that he sees around the world are those that go elsewhere, either digitally go elsewhere, train elsewhere, take ideas from New York or LA, and then bring those ideas in concept back to their hometown. And so what I'd love to hear is what that's looked like to translate some of the things that you've been inspired by, whether in real life scenarios or inspiration on things that you can check out on your phone at any point, and to translate it back. And then Danny, to conclude us, to say a little bit of what the opposite has been like for you, to translate pieces of your hometown into the places you've gone since then. Gerard.
Yeah, I think, most of the restaurants that we have are kind of based on either somewhere else or something else, and I think Cinder House, as you were talking about earlier, that's at the Four Seasons, is an expression on a lot of the food that I was actually raised on. And, you don't see a lot of Brazilian food out there today, and especially, not in the churrascaria style of restaurant, but a restaurant that's serving, rustic, really homey and soulful Brazilian food. So, that was something that we decided to kind of like dig deep in, and go back in time and go into, my history and get to kind of bring a piece of that to everybody else. And I think, same with all the other restaurants, whether they're reflections of my travels in France or Italy, they're all kind of reflecting a vision of somewhere else. And I think Niche, when we had it, was the only restaurant that was really doing a reflection of St. Louis. I mean, it was, 97%, I think, local ingredients. So it's stark contrast in all of those different things. And I think both are, great for people who don't get to travel that much to kind of take a step in. And Kevin Nashan taking a trip to the Chesapeake, brought me back to my childhood in Washington, D.C. So.
That's great. Kevin, what about for you?
Early 90s, mid 90s, there was no real cell phones or anything, so there was no choice. I had to go to New York, I had to go to New Orleans, had to go and live in Spain and France, because I wanted to be exposed to it. I think in this time age, there's kind of like, as Danny said, there's incredible restaurants in St. Louis, but I don't think I think it's still will always be a necessity to go out and experience. The Galenas just moved back, and the incredible restaurant Vicia. And I'm so excited that they came back to their hometown and opened this incredible restaurant. And they would have never gotten that experience anywhere else that shaped them and who they are. Yeah, there's incredible restaurants to work here. However, the exposure what places give you are second to none. And you can't see them on Instagram, you can't feel them. You need to really chew on it. And only way to chew on it is to live in San Sebastian with 48 other cooks in a bunk bed with 2 showers, and the American gets the last shower. And wondering to myself,
selling it hard.
and wondering to myself, like 3 weeks into it, my parents were like, "What are you doing?" And you know what I'm doing? I'm living my life, and it's amazing. But those experiences are what has made the food parts in my life, and I think that's what makes it unique. Our restaurants are very different than Gerard's and Zoe's and Mr. Meyer's, and that's why we have a community, and that's why we want to go out and support. And I think that's for me, that's the most important part.
So what about for you? Where does that inspiration come from, and how has that been brought back into St. Louis?
Well, travel is important, and sometimes I'll travel and I'm picking up things that I don't really know I'm picking up, but later on it comes up. It's there. It's in that encyclopedia up there. You know, what I've gathered. Travel is important. I think also now for me, reading and film and, you know, any type of art, anything visual that I can get my hands on is an inspiration to me. So it's so easy now with the internet that, you know, we didn't have many years ago, and we were all talking about that the other night, that we actually, if we couldn't take that trip to New York or go to Italy, we would go get the books, actual books, and we would have, you know, piles of them that I would drag back and forth from work, you know, to really try to get that feel. There is no replacement for travel and for immersing yourself into something. That's true. But I think just gathering all of those little things is what inspires me. And they may come out in completely different ways, but they form my picture.
And the thing, before we get to Danny to conclude us here, the thing that is so fun for me, getting to know these folks here, has been if you walk into Dia's room, if you walk into Sydney Street, if you walk into Billie Jean, you see expressions of those inspirations over time. And I think knowing those expressions actually makes it an even richer experience. To know, for example, a little bit of the stories on the people that are framed on the wall in Peacemaker brings a power to it. Right? Knowing a bit of the art, the particular choices you made around artists, makes it more real than just seeing it on a particular wall. So, Danny, for you, what does it look like to blend St. Louis and other places you've been around the world into your role as chef, as this mix of artist and executive?
It's really easy for me, hospitality. You know, in all fairness, when I grew up here, there wasn't nearly the restaurant scene and food scene that there is today. No one was talking about local ingredients. Maybe they were using them, but I didn't ever hear about it. And one of my chefs, the night before I came here, said, "Please don't bring any of that Provel cheese back."
Bring him a big hunk of it.
So, you know, that's kind of, but hospitality, the thing that I didn't find anywhere in Manhattan in 1985 was that. It was like the restaurants that were doing the best were the ones that kind of looked down their noses at you the most and charged too much money. And there was this very strange New York mentality that I saw in the early 1980s, which was the worse someone treated me, the more I wanted to eat there. And I thought that was really weird. And I just asked this question, well, what if I could bring the way I always felt treated here in St. Louis with the kind of food that I'd been exposed to in France and Italy and in New York. You know, New York had a very Europe-facing culinary scene at that point. Now it's really international in a lot of ways. But whoever wrote the rule that I would like the place less if they were as nice to me in New York as they would be in St. Louis. So that was it. Then I started later to experiment with some different things. I mean, there's no question that Blue Smoke, both with the Jazz Standard downstairs and the barbecue restaurant upstairs, a lot of great memories from St. Louis. You know, we were playing with toasted ravioli with our own pulled pork on the inside, smoked tomato sauce instead of marinara. You know, St. Louis rib tips, which I hadn't had anywhere in New York City, and fried chicken and collard greens. And then you come to learn that whatever you make with all those things, someone has a better version of, and they tell you. And it's usually their mother or their father who made a, you should taste my mother's potato salad. It's way better than yours. But actually, one of the best desserts we ever had at Blue Smoke came from going to Schlafly's, which was the sticky toffee pudding. And I just took it right to Blue Smoke, and poof, it turns out.
Did you hear that sound here? Did you hear the?
Yeah, tastes really good after all that smoke in your mouth to have some sticky toffee pudding. But it's hospitality. There's no question about it. And then the last thing I'll say is I couldn't agree more with Zoe, which is that as we're, you know, we've come to a point right now where people think they're getting experiences by going to Instagram, and you truly would not have to travel if you didn't want to, and you could open a restaurant. You could see the recipe, see the dish, see if people like it or not, and then decide to cook it. But you're completely missing out on the real experience and what it feels like. And every one of us has a thumbprint that we put on things. I mean, I remember this from being a kid, and we all had the same Nestle's yellow bag of chips with the exact same recipe on the back, but every house, the chocolate chip cookies tasted a little different for some reason. Why was that? Because that family, whoever made them, put their thumbprint on it, and that's all we're doing, just on a much, much bigger level.
Fantastic. This is the kind of thing I think that universities should be doing, having conversations at the intersection of creatives, people in business, and engaging the community. And as I mentioned earlier, part of the dialogue is here, out, but a lot of it is amongst you all and amongst the panelists here moving forward. So as you go eat some of the best food in St. Louis that we could pull together
At 9
here,
a.m.
I hope that you do continue the conversation and continue the conversation around this intersection of art and business and what it looks like for you moving forward. So without further ado, I want to thank all 4 of our panelists for their work here.
How about that guy right there?
Thank you, Peter.
Let's eat. Let's eat. Thank you, everyone.